It's 1898. The Philippines are ablaze with rebellion as they rise up against the Spanish colonists, driving them back as the Spanish themselves head to war with America. But 54 Spanish men in a small town of Baler refuse to surrender. They hold up in a church as the last men fighting in Spain, in a war already lost. Hello and welcome to Remember, the show all about histories, mysteries and revolution. It's always been about revolving. Screw the Spanish.
It's always been about getting stuck in those revolving doors in front of fancy hotels that mostly exist in places that get winter weather.
A terrible Spanish hotel that looks like a hellscape. Spain's nice, honestly.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would love to go to Spain. I've never been there. I've never thought of it as a hellscape.
The motto for this period of history is screw the Spanish for a lot of people. But honestly, have you been to Spain? It's pretty ace. I'm joined by Paula. Let's all get along Deming. And my name, as the Filipinos call me, is Kakabang Tulala. But you can call me Matthew.
Well, and what does that mean?
It means strange idiot.
Not the direction I thought you were going to go with that, and I respect you for it.
I normally go with handsome foreigner.
I definitely thought it was going to be something like that, yes.
The Spanish, love them or loathe them, and the Filipinos loathe them, had their heyday in the South Seas. But in the late 1800s, things were not going as well with the Spanish occupation of the Philippines or anywhere else they had hoped. And while the Filipinos were the ones putting on the shoe of rebellion, it would be the isolationist America who would be coming in to do the booting.
Well, you know how we like to do. We're like, nah, just us, until we decide, actually, we will get up in other people's business and swoop in.
Well, honestly, this is that key turning point in American history.
Where we go, you know what, we will. This is where it began, where we decide we're going to get involved in everyone else's issues.
This is the height of jingoism. This is the time when America started to say, actually, we want to be a big player as well. We can certainly afford to do so. For a little historical context, it's 1898.
What?
And the Spanish...
Historical context? On this show?
It's terrible.
A history podcast? I don't know.
The Spanish-American War is popping off pretty brutally. It's a war that destroyed the vestiges of Spanish colonial rule in the Americas and the Pacific. And while the American rule to come isn't without its downsides, it certainly changes the political landscape of the world. Not least the idea of America itself being an isolationist country. This was some big intervention in a huge way. And frankly, it's a position that the USA had never had, and it has never changed.
Yeah.
The Spanish-American War kind of started a few years before while Cuba was erupting in a struggle for independence, and the Americans wanted to help out.
Why? Oil?
No, sugar, actually.
Well, you know, basically the same thing in the way.
The Americans just owned a huge amount of stuff on Cuba, and a huge amount of stuff on Cuba was being set on fire.
Oof. And that, you know what? The smell of burning sugar is actually pretty nice, but when that also smells like burning money, then it gets real bad, you know?
Burning sugar smells nice to a point.
Right, that's a good point. And then you're like, oh no.
To pull down an epic story of politics in a few sentences, two things are fairly true. The Spanish weren't ready for a war with America, nor had they expected one. And the Americans weren't ready for a war with Spain, but they had been ramping up their navy, both physically and practically. There's a lot of influence here from Teddy Roosevelt, who was gunning for a presidential office, something that would happen, straight after this. But the US were essentially an army of the 1900s, fighting a Spain still languishing in the mid-1800s. And the Spanish lost big time.
Yeah, and this is interesting because we allude to some of these things as well in the episode we did about the newsboy strike. Because a lot of what happened with the Spanish-American War and newspapers led to the situation that led to the newsboy strike. So we've circled around this topic in a couple of episodes now without actually devoting our time to it, I guess.
Well, this was certainly big news. But the Philippines was one place the Spanish held, but things weren't going great there as well. The KKK,
Oh.
not that KKK, a different KKK. It's the Katipunan, which were Filipino revolutionaries
Okay.
who had been up and running for a while. A revolution had already started around 1896, so tensions were pretty high. And essentially, the different people around the world being controlled by the Spanish were all spurring each other on to rebel. And with the American intervention, it's Spain that loses, and the American portion of Filipino control begins.
Yep. Sorry, I'm just laughing at like, hey, we helped you, but now we control you.
To a greater extent, Paula, that's what happens.
Yeah, I mean, that's how all these like bigger countries, I mean, this is just how like global politics and stuff I feel like works, but it's, yeah.
Like, I've been to the Philippines, and when you get there, you go, wow, there is such a huge American influence on this country. And you walk around Manila and you see a lot of stuff. You go, this is, I mean, obviously there's vast differences as well, but sometimes you go, yeah, you can tell that this, you know, if you go to like some parts of Vietnam, you can go, oh yeah, you can tell that this area was
This was the French.
controlled by the French.
This is the, yeah.
You know, or you go to Hong Kong and you go, oh, the British were here.
Yeah.
You can tell. Or you go to Macau and you can see that the Portuguese were there because the traditions and the architecture and all that stuff. When you go to parts of the Philippines, you can go, oh, yeah, the Americans were here. You can just tell.
Well, even it's not quite the same, but it always makes me think of the city of New Orleans, which had both French and Spanish influences, which are still there today, even just in the way the streets are named. They have like French and Spanish names. Like it's really interesting. So yeah, I always think of New Orleans when I think of like signs of who was there at some point.
Well, I mean, just compare Connecticut to San Diego.
Oh gosh, for real.
You know what I mean?
You can definitely tell that the British went to New England and ended up being the ones who named everything, because every little town in Connecticut is just basically the name of a British town.
And we're not going to get into this too much because there's so much Filipino history that you could look up, and there's a lot of interesting parts of it. But I think what a lot of people forget about Filipino history is that the Spanish were there and they had their own slave trade. And they were carting slaves from the South Seas over the Pacific to the west coast of America. And it was a huge slave trade. And even though it got outlawed, people still did it anyway.
Of course, yeah.
Like the King of Spain said, we do not deal in slaves. And everyone who dealt in slaves went, what the king doesn't know won't hurt him.
Yeah. The king's very far away from where we are right now. Yeah.
So that's just one of myriad reasons why you can appreciate that the Philippines were sick of the Spanish.
Yeah.
But there's a small garrison of men in a little town on the coast of Luzon, that's the big island. It's 170 miles northeast of Manila. And while the fighting around them had stopped, they refused to lay down their arms. And they would become the final stand of the entire Spanish Empire in a small coastal town called Baler.
Did they know that everyone else was done fighting and they just didn't want to, or did they not know?
We'll find out.
Okay. All right. Foreshadowing, maybe.
So Baler, as a modern settlement, was founded by a Spanish guy named Fray Juan Francisco de Santantonio, who was a Franciscan missionary, and he'd built the original church. He also became its first priest at the start of the 1600s. Then, over the next 100 years, a bigger church was built to facilitate a growing community. But on December 27th, 1735, a massive tidal wave hit. This destructive tsunami, known as Tromba Marina, hit the eastern coast of Luzon, and it was devastating. Side note, Tromba Marina is a Baroque trumpet consisting of a single string. It's around 2 meters long and is played entirely with harmonics.
Wait, it's a trumpet with a string?
Now, when I looked that up, Paula, including a picture, I still have no idea how this instrument works. All I'm guessing is that it's very loud.
You're going to have to send me the picture you found of that so I can put it in the YouTube video for everyone.
So this tidal wave hits, and I've been to Baler. I've spent time there. I went there because of this story. I wanted to go to where this had happened. And there's a big mural of the history of the town on one wall. And a big part of it is the start where this tidal wave hits, and it's certainly remembered by the town.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they moved the whole town just inland a little bit. I'm sure the locals were like talking amongst themselves, going, "Yeah, that's why we didn't build the town here."
Yeah.
You know? It's like when they cut down all the mangroves in coastal regions, and then a tidal wave hits, and everyone was like, "Yeah, there was a
That's
reason
why
we let the
those
mangroves
were there."
there."
Yeah.
But importantly, they built a new church, a sturdy, fortified building that could last out a terrible storm. But that's also a pretty good building to hide in if you're being chased, I don't know, by the entire local population of an island, which is, in 1898, the situation 54 Spanish soldiers were about to find themselves in.
Look, the siege of a tidal wave, the siege of opposing forces, not so different, really, when you think about it.
Siege, siege,
Siege.
you know,
Ooh, yeah.
it's the same thing.
It's the same.
Language, it exists. So already by 1898, the Baler garrison were digging a well within the church, as well as stocking it up with food, weapons, and ammunition. They were stationed there to help stop the flow of weapons to the Filipino revolutionaries. And they knew that if things were going to go south for some reason, that the church was going to be where they were going to run to and hide. Frankly, it's the only stone building in town. And they could put enough stuff in it to hold out for a good few months and wait for reinforcements. Or, just wait until everything kind of blown over.
Yeah, like surely everyone will just, if you wait long enough, people will stop being so upset, and then you'll be able to leave the church and it'll be fine because they'll have forgotten about it. They'll move on to the next thing, right?
That's what you always do in a siege. The people being besieged just wait out the siegers. That's definitely the way around that works.
Eventually, the siegers get bored. They're like,
Go
oh,
home.
they're never coming out. Can we please do anything else? I'm so bored.
The British were stationed outside Orleans, just thinking, gosh, I wish something interesting would happen. You don't, because something interesting happening is Joan of Arc turns up and everything went south. Or north, depending on your perspective, I suppose, of the 100 Years' War. But that's neither here nor there.
That's for a different episode.
The church had been used a couple times years ago for just that reason, right? Where the Filipinos first rose up against the Spanish. But that had been diplomatically and evidently temporarily tempered. But these Spanish troops had no idea how bad things were going over in Manila. It's 170 miles away. And it's lucky, in a way, that they were planning for the worst.
And they think, like, real troops are going to come and be here with us eventually.
Their idea, of course, is that if something terrible happens here in Baler, someone will send out some troops from Manila to come help us.
Yeah.
Things were not going well enough in Manila to send out troops.
There were no troops to send, right, but they don't realize that.
Along with the provisions, they boarded up the windows, dug a trench around the church, so it's also pretty obvious to the Filipinos what the plan was.
And they're like, I feel like they're fortifying this building here.
Definitely spending a lot of time praying to Jesus.
They're putting a lot of spikes inside of a pit they're digging around this building. Do you think they're hoping to keep us out of it?
Is that some strange Spanish custom that we have yet to observe?
I don't know. To us, that seems a bit no bueno. However they would say in Tagalog.
What the Spanish didn't know was that they had already lost the war. They didn't notice that on June the 26th, the people in town all kind of started to leave. This was not peculiar. What was strange, though, was when the next day, 800 Filipino troops turn up. That was somewhat out of the ordinary. And the next day, June 30th, that the Filipinos attack, and it's then that the Spanish retreat to the church.
Okay, so they've been prepping it, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, time to use it.
Time to go. It's like all the people are leaving town. Oh, all the people are back, and they brought their friends, and things are about to be terrible for us. The first thing the Filipinos did was try diplomacy. Well, the second, actually, after the initial attack. They found 2 Franciscan friars who they wanted to send into the church to talk to the Spanish and implore them to surrender.
It's like, look, we don't have to fight. We won. Y'all it's cool. Just, like, surrender. It's fine. Everybody else has already.
That was essentially the option given. We already won. We don't need to fight. You need to go home now. And also, you're surrounded. But the Franciscan friars instead joined the Spanish.
Oh, no. So they're supposed to go in and, like, hostage negotiate, basically. And instead they're like, we're actually going to stay here with you.
They went in, they joined their Spanish brothers in arms, never came back out.
Oh, no. Oh, why?
So the other tactic used straight off the bat, essentially pretty close to the start of this, was that one night under the cover of darkness, they decided, we'll just burn this church down.
Oh, no.
They sent a few men to get onto the roof to set the wooden infrastructure alight, but one soldier was holding a position in the bell tower. Bell tower come sniper, watch out. He saw the Filipinos and managed to shoot at them. And the Spanish made the decision to sound the bugles of battle. You can appreciate that they're in the 1800s, right? This was to attempt to convince the Filipinos that, the Spanish, they're all going to come out and we're going to head this off at the pass. And that bluff worked. The Filipinos left to then approach what they believed was the Spanish or leaving the church, but they never did leave the church. And now they couldn't get back on top to set it on fire because everyone was pointing guns at everyone.
Yeah. Those guns will get in the way.
Look, I've been to this church. This is not a big building. It's not exactly the same now as it was. The courtyard that would have been there is now part of a little school, but this is very much what a British person, for example, would recognize as a small parish church. And it was a place that for 54 men, 56, I guess, if those friars are there, to be held up inside there would have been cramped, uncomfortable, and frankly terrifying.
Probably kind of smelly.
We're going to get into this.
Oh, no. Ugh.
And this was how the siege began. A siege that was going to last a long time.
Why didn't they just go home?
Well, they're waiting for the Spanish to come and rescue them, to help out. They don't know.
They're like, we don't need to go home. What are they talking about that we've lost? No, we haven't. We just need to wait. How in the world would our people have lost this? Yeah.
They have the right to be there, they think. We're in charge. And as I said before, they were there to stop the movement of guns getting to the Filipino revolutionaries.
So it's important to them. They're like, we can't leave our post. We have an important job we're doing here that is going to help us continue to be winners. But they don't realize they're already not winners anymore.
But that also stands to explain the differential in firepower. The Filipinos weren't locked and loaded at this point in history. So July the 1st is here and the siege has begun. The Spanish were stuck inside, but they were really well stocked. They had flour, chickpeas, coffee, cured pork, cans of sardines, as well as guns and 24,000 bullets.
Jeez, because they've been confiscating all the weaponry that's been coming through and hoarding it.
And they've been preparing for this. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The Filipinos were the ones that needed to stock up if they wanted to camp 800 men outside and siege a building. This reminds me of, we haven't covered this on the channel, but the siege of Fort Zealandia in Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of are all inside the fort.
We touched on it briefly, I think, in the Duck King episode, but yeah.
We did, but there's so many people outside. They're hugely outnumbered, but it's hard you've got to create a town if you're going to siege a town,
Yeah, you're really just trying to wait them out in terms of supplies, I feel like.
Well, and the thing is that this is just a church. You would think, if the Spanish had been there, or the Americans, or if the British were there, they could have just blown the church up with siege weaponry and artillery. But they don't have any cannons or siege engines. So this is a stalemate.
Yeah.
And it's a stalemate that means something because it's perhaps the last Spanish flag on Luzon.
Wow.
So a second trench is dug by the Filipinos so they could fire on the church while the Spanish would spend their days shooting anything that moved outside. But some days just the pattering of bullets would be hard, and some days fighting would be harsh. They can't go on forever. 24,000 bullets sounds like a lot of bullets, but it's not that many
Eventually you run
bullets.
out. Look, I've played Bloodborne, and like the start of the game, I was like, I have like 300 blood vials. And then suddenly you're like, wow, I cannot heal anymore.
Yeah.
Because I was like, I got 300 blood vials. I can just heal myself. It doesn't matter. And then suddenly you're like, oh no,
I'm screwed.
I did that too, willy-nilly.
And, to start off with, this kind of feels like a bit of a First World War gentleman's agreement of a battle, of a siege, for good sportsmanship and fair play. But it really wasn't that. The Spanish couldn't kill everyone outside, and they were just trying to hold on for dear life, while the Filipinos were frustratingly trying to, one by one, kill the Spaniards, which just wasn't that easy to do. The one thing they could do was wear away the wooden boards and the doors, hoping to get a bullet through the tiny gaps that they could create. And they were successful sometimes. A sniper gets shot in the chest pretty early on, but it's very slow going for the Filipinos.
Ugh.
As time paces on, it's peaceful negotiations that the Filipinos again attempt. They really want to let the Spanish know that the war is over. They lost and should just go home.
Just leave. We don't want to kill you. Just go.
And this is kind of counteracted by the times where instead the Filipinos were just outside, generally being as loud as possible for as long as possible in what is essentially rudimentary forms of psychic warfare.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely some psychological attacks happening there.
And then they would hand them newspapers sometimes that showed that the war was lost. They spent time talking with each other on diplomatic excursions. I mean, from where the trenches were to where the Filipinos and to where the two sides of the fighters were, you could just shout and talk to each other. This is a small town. And I tell you now, lovely beaches. But
I bet some of them like knew each other beforehand too. Like some of the people on the outside of the church probably knew the people on the inside of the church when everybody was outside and inside the church whenever they wanted to be.
Well, exactly. And one thing I really like is that there were times that the Filipinos allowed the Spanish to leave to collect food and fruit and cigarettes, which sounds so crazy. But in many ways, both sides were trying to not have to kill everyone.
Wow.
But then at other times, the Spanish would attempt plots and plans. There was one time where the Spanish, at night, they broke out of the church and they attempted to burn down as much of the town as possible.
Oh my gosh.
Setting fire to as many houses as they could. One evening while the Filipinos were mostly out of town.
That's fucked up.
Yeah, and that was one night over 100 days in.
Oh my gosh.
100 days in a little church as things inside began to grow desperate.
Ugh.
The town might now be semi-burnt down to the ground, but the siege was far from over. This is only about 5 months in.
Only 5 months in.
So you can understand why people might be resorting to incredible tactics.
It's just, I'm imagining the conversations potentially happening inside of this church. The people who are like, why are we still doing this? And the other people who are like, no, we can't give up. And just like the negotiations within the group of people, within, the Spaniards, of like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? And the ones who are arguing that they need to be doing it. And
I'll say now, not everyone agrees.
Yeah, I bet.
They've lost 20 men.
And they started with what, like
54?
54. So they're almost half down. That's a lot of people to be losing.
But even with far fewer mouths to feed, supplies were starting to run low. There are some really simple things that in a siege are just logistical nightmares. Like, where are they going to the bathroom?
Yeah.
What's that situation look like? I bet it's not great.
Yeah.
Where are they going to bury the dead?
Yeah.
The food they had was beginning to rot.
Mm-hmm.
They were able to, as we said, forage for oranges sometimes. And after they'd set fire to the town, they were able to sometimes go out hunting for food. But I can't imagine their vitamin C situation is going fantastic.
Yeah.
And most importantly is, what were they going to use to cook their food? You need something to burn in order to make the dry ingredients edible. Whatever was left in the church to burn was long gone. And
oh, yeah. They're like, well, we've burned all the hymnals.
And they need the hardwood, if they have any, to board up the windows. They can't burn their fortifications. So how are the most basic of necessities being met? And the answer is undoubtedly that they weren't.
And that's when they turn to cannibalism. Yeah?
No, this doesn't have
Oh,
cannibalism.
okay. Just, you never know.
Morale was their biggest battle they had to face. 5 of the garrison had deserted them.
Yeah, I probably would have. I'd be like, forget this mess.
I don't know. I think I would have just been like, what are we doing? I'm leaving.
Yeah.
I think that might be where But also, it's not just as easy to just leave.
No, and I can see some people being like, well, I would love this to be over, but it can't be because if we just leave, the people outside are going to kill us anyway. So we have to hold out. Like they may feel that way, whether that's true or not. That might be what they think.
And I think this has already gone on far too long.
Yeah.
They've killed half of us already. We've killed a bunch of them. We're past negotiations here, right? And some of the people had deserted. They literally joined the Filipinos.
What?
A couple had been shot, but the biggest issue was Berry, which, sparing the details, is just awful.
That's the person's name? Oh, I thought someone had been named Berry, and I was like, oh no, okay, this is a disease. Okay.
It's Mary Berry. Now, she's here to cook a cake with dynamite inside.
It's the British version of a Trojan horse. Here's a Battenberg cake with some explosives.
That's German.
Well, they make it on the Great British Bake Off, so what do I know?
Here's some crumpets. Don't bite too hard. So beriberi is a disease causing inflammation of the nerves and heart failure due to vitamin B1 deficiency. You do not normally see beriberi unless circumstances are pretty dire.
Is it kind of like getting scurvy?
Very similar to getting scurvy because it will kill you.
Yeah.
It's B1 is in stuff like cereal, pork, beans, stuff they've got, but they're starting to get very sick. Both commanding officers had died of this, meaning that in charge was the third in command, a frankly underprepared Saturnino Martens Cerezo.
Look, it's not his fault that he was just the Secretary of Education, He was next in command. This is just how it works until there's time to hold more elections.
This is like lower decks, though. This is, you don't put them in command right now. This is, like, he realized that things were not going according to plan. They're now 7 months in. The town was much more deserted than anything else. It felt as though the Filipinos were just not even bothering they're like, we're just going to wait for them to come out. We're going to go on our normal lives and just wait for them to come out and kill them. Well, that's what they thought, at least. And
yeah.
It's so strange because they decide to turn their own trench, which is on the outside, they turn it into a garden in the hopes to grow a little food for themselves.
Oh my gosh.
Christmas comes and goes without much fanfare, but the war was now over. I mean, properly over. Treaties had been signed.
Wow.
And peace had been declared. The only people still fighting were the boys in Baler. And it's a much bigger story surrounding what's going on in the Philippines. The Americans had actually declared war on them.
Oh, okay.
Essentially, they become the new colonial overlords. As far as anyone was really concerned, the Americans had bought the Philippines for $20 million, and it was now theirs. Just no one had asked the Filipinos about any of this.
Right.
It's just a weird situation in this place now. It's like there is a siege technically going on. They are firing on each other. They are killing each other. But there's also time for gardening. They just can't leave.
Just like, don't mind us. We're just filling in the trench and planting some things and hoping, maybe we'll grow some potatoes.
And here's the thing with the layout of Baler, and having been there, it's easier to kind of see in my mind, is that the church and all that type of stuff is in the center of town, right? And they'd moved the town further from the coast. It's not far from the coast. It's a 10-minute, 15-minute walk from the coast. But there's a big river that goes through the town and obviously leads out to the sea. So they can't just hope a ship is going to grab them all and they can just jump on and run off because there's just too much time. They're kind of stuck. They're really stuck. Yeah. They're not kind of stuck. They are being sieged. They are incredibly stuck. But it's now the Americans that have to deal with this Baler situation. And the Spanish had tried. Officials from Spain had been to Baler. The guy who went there had been friends with the Baler garrison commander, but that commander was dead.
Oh my gosh, did they just not listen to him?
Yeah, Cerezo, who is now in command, third in charge, is now in command. He thought that this officer was just another ruse by the Filipinos.
Oh my gosh, dude, you're losing your mind. You've been stuck here for too long.
They're losing their minds. So much actually happened, but without communications, the Baler garrison were just unwilling to believe any of it. This reminds me of, those stories of someone actually happening to be in the Philippines, a Japanese soldier in the Philippines who's still fighting the Second World War.
Yeah.
It's that kind of stuff. Because sometimes it really sucks to have to say, I was wrong.
Yes.
And these Spanish, they were wrong.
And at this point, talk about sunk cost fallacy, right? You're like, I cannot bring myself.
That's exactly it.
These people died, and I might die at any moment from freaking beriberi disease. And that can't have been for nothing. This cannot have been a 7-8 month mistake. So no, it's not over. This is going to be worth it.
In a way as well, you got to think it is noble. And I do believe that of these type of situations. It's noble, and in ways it's incredibly brave, but it's also hopeless.
I think it reaches a point, though, where...
Futile. The whole thing's futile.
I do think it reaches a point where it's not brave anymore. It's like the real bravery would be in admitting that it's time to be done with this. Like, there comes a point where it's just like, dude, you're wrong. You're wrong. And the real bravery comes in, admitting it and dealing with the consequences.
Yeah, I can see that. But, I don't know. It's really hard to come to that conclusion. It's really hard to do that, though.
That's what makes that in my mind, that's what makes that, the brave choice. But to know when it's time for that and when it's time to stick it out, right? That's the question. How do you know?
They're brave, and they are at times courageous, but they certainly aren't noble or wise.
Yes, yeah.
And because instead of listening to this official, they fire on him until he goes away.
That guy's like, dudes, all right, fine. Dig your own graves, which you're literally doing right now in that Carden Trench.
Honestly, one of the best things that happens that is in March, they managed to shoot a water buffalo and drag it back to the church. And I've seen wild water buffalo in Baler. And they are massive animals. And I can't imagine they taste great.
I've ridden on a water buffalo in Guam. I got to ride on it in the ocean. It was one of the coolest experiences of my life. But they are big. They are big animals.
And they are a source of vitamin B1. So that's really what's important.
Well, there you go. Okay, that's good.
So it's about 240 days now into the siege.
Oh my gosh, 240
Honestly,
days?
the Spanish are dying off.
Yeah.
And not just by the hands of their enemies. 3 men attempt to desert, but they are found and put on trial.
Oh my gosh, now they're having freaking kangaroo court? Come on.
So they try to flee, and this attempt's thwarted, and they throw them in a prison. Now, there is no prison in this church. So I have to imagine they were put into a very small well or a room or something.
They took some of the
Awful
pews
conditions.
and they just kind of tilted them up and shoved them against the wall.
Paula, I need to tell you, the pews are gone.
Those have been gone. They were used to board up windows and make fires. That's not...
So the Americans really now want to solve this issue. Because it's just... Don't go to Baler. Why? They're still fighting the war.
They're still fighting the Spanish War.
And the Filipinos really want to take the church, right? Because it is full of guns. So that's something that they want. And the Americans do not want the Filipinos to get all these guns.
Yeah, that's fair.
So the Yorktown, which is a gunboat, turns up at the coast. And a few men canoe up the river to attempt to talk to the Spanish of Baler, which directly went against the wishes of the Filipinos. They had not agreed to this situation.
They're like, no, we're dealing with this.
Well,
You
the
stay out of
Americans
it.
thought that they could just turn up, solve the problem,
Right.
and they did what the Spanish did. It's like, well, we're in charge. We can do what we want. It's like, no, you can't. So the Filipinos fire on this boat.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, those rivers really wide, and they spot it, and they just there's just one canoe in a boat on a river, and the Filipinos are on the riverbank, and they're like, okay, we'll just shoot you. You've got no cover. You're just there.
What a
and kills 4 of them. And
mess.
they kill 4 of them and take some hostages, prisoners of war. Yorktown sees this happen and goes, we're leaving. And they sail away.
Like, all right then, bye. Solve it yourself.
But you have to imagine the morale of the soldiers in the church, because they think this is a Spanish boat. And they see it just sail away.
It's the meme of like the little girl, like the little gif. You can find a little girl and it's like raining outside her window and she's just like against the window. It's that.
Very much so. If there was any glass left in any of those windows. It's not until day 333 that more Spanish eventually do show up. But they have official papers to say, this is the situation. You need to come home now. We're all very proud.
So proud.
Cerezo still.
Oh my God.
And the reason he didn't believe the first lot was because they weren't dressed in military uniform. So these lot are dressed in military uniform, if I'm remembering that part of the story correctly. So there's like, but he still doesn't believe them. He couldn't believe anyone or anything. And these Spanish, again, have to go.
I can't believe they're not mutinying against him at this point. Like, how everyone else is just like, yeah, you're right. Everyone's lying to us.
I mean, this is
It's
very small
wild.
group of men now who are just...
Yeah.
They've been there almost a year. And the Spanish, as they leave, these officials who come to try to convince them, they're heard saying, in Spanish, of course, we will leave them to their fate if that is what they desire.
Yeah, it's like, all right, I guess y'all are just going to die in there.
They gave up on them. And they said, if they want to die here, then they can die here.
Well, there's only so much you can do if someone is not willing to believe that you're there to help them. Then you can't help them. There comes a point where you're like, all right, that's all the resources I can put toward this. Like, that, you've chosen this.
They didn't see Spain lose the war. They weren't there for it. So in their mind, they don't want to believe that that was possible. And they don't want to know in their heart that all of what they'd been for had
was
been
nothing.
for nothing.
Yeah.
Which ultimately it had been for nothing.
Yeah.
So the Spanish envoys leave them with more newspapers. And finally, the truth dawns on them. Cerezo, though, was a stupid man. Because I don't understand why. But before he agrees to surrender, he orders his own prisoners, 2 of the men that had tried to escape, executed.
What? I think he's just lost his mind. Like, seriously, there's been some breaks with reality. There's some coping mechanisms that have failed, I think, at this point. Like, he's acting out. I think there's no other way to... He just can't process everything, and that he's acting out, because that's something... Here's my armchair Monday morning psychologist diagnosis of the situation. Has no control. The thing he thought he had control over, he realizes is fake. The Spanish have not won. This whole thing has been for nothing. You know something he does still have control over before he exits this place?
I'm still commander of these guys, yeah.
He can order those people executed. I think it's a bid for feeling like he has some sense of control over what's happening. But that's, again, my Monday morning psychiatrist.
It's day 337 when they finally walk out and go home. The siege was over without anything being won, with so much lost, and all for nothing. The thing is as well is that they won't go into all of this now, but when they go home, they don't really come home to a fanfare. They don't even get, like, the Spanish, they won't even pay them for their entire time they've been away. It's like, no, you get paid for a certain amount of time. We're not paying you for... We stopped fighting this war. You were the ones that didn't come home.
We tried to get you to come back and you didn't. I'm not paying you for time that, like...
A lot of them couldn't get jobs in the army again. There's mixed results, and in fairness, later on, they're kind of known as heroes in a way, but they certainly didn't come home to a hero's welcome or anything like that. They weren't treated particularly well, these men. And I think that's a big miscarriage of justice in its own right, because they'd been through a lot. And I'll tell you what was a wonderful place was I went to the museum. There's a small museum in the town. And obviously a lot of the museum is to do with the siege. There's uniforms, photographs of what it looked like at the time, photographs after it, a wonderful amount of stuff. And if you're ever in Baler, which is a good few hours drive east of Manila, if you're ever there, I totally advise going in. There's nothing better to me than a small town museum. I love small town museums because they're always... The research done in those type of places is always done with such love, I think, and such desire to preserve the history of a place. It's like near me, like there's the Red House Cone and stuff like that in the UK, and there's little museums and stuff, and they always want to, because this is what we've got here. It's not much, but it's ours kind of feeling. I will say that I absolutely could not have made this show today without the Colonial Department podcast, which is an amazing Philippines-focused show that first introduced me to this story.
Wow.
There's a book called Baler in Flames by Carlos Madrid, which also documents this really well. And I only found out about that book, again, because of the Colonial Department podcast. It's fantastic if you're interested in colonial Philippine history. It's a great show. I've listened to lots of it. And of course, my own personal trip to Baler and the museum there, which was absolutely wonderful.
And you can watch videos of Matthew's travel to Baler and his whole trip in the Philippines. If you check out his travel vlog on YouTube, it's called Yesland Travel. So go check that out. I think you will like it.
Well, you could join me as I go around the church and look at all the history of the town. It was a great trip, honestly.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Remember. Matthew, thank you so much for bringing this story to us. This was like wild, interesting, and for me, like frustrating that they didn't just... But thank you so much. If you are enjoying what you are listening to here, you could do a couple things for us. You could leave us a rating and review wherever you listen. We really appreciate everyone who does that. It helps us in our discoverability on these platforms, and it helps encourage people to check out the podcast because they see that other people like it. You can also, if you're on YouTube right now, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Leave us some comments and let us know what you thought about this episode. And of course, subscribe in your podcast feed if you're listening via podcast. Thank you so much. We really appreciate all of you for being here. Matthew, you're wonderful. My name's Paula. That's who we've been. And we'll see you next time with our next episode.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.